Welcome, ladies, gentlemen, folks, to the 13th book Adda. Vidhi's book Adda takes up a really promising book that's come out in the recent times, and we have a discussion with the author to try and unpack many of the things that people would like to know if they actually read the book, and many of the things that are unsaid, the premises in the book which are unsaid. While Vidhi is an organization that has been working in legal policy, and so we are often interested in matters of the law, but we are very much aware that the law has a considerable interplay with various other aspects of life and of governance, of regulation, of society, and politics. We have with us today Subhashish Bhadra. He has written this book, the book that we will be discussing today, Caged Tiger, How Too Much Government Has Been Holding Indians Back. How too much government is holding Indians back. Subhashish is he's a trained economist, and he did his undergrad in economics in St. Stephen's here in Delhi, and later on as a Rhodes Scholar he was in Oxford doing his MPhil also in economics. Since half a decade, he's been working in the space of public policy in India, specifically technology policy and regulatory governance, digital rights. And this has gotten him in touch, fascinatingly, with a wide array of people from civil society, corporate leadership, bureaucrats in government. And he perhaps is in a position to be able to give us a panoramic view of how many of these things function in India, many of these aspects of society function in India. The book in question that we are discussing today, I think it's very apt that we are discussing this just immediately after the 77th Independence Day. You'll often hear when people discuss, when Independence Day comes around, you'll hear people saying that, yes, we won independence so many years ago, but what was that independence for? Why is it that we fought against the British? What were we as individuals really losing out on when we were subject to a foreign government? And inevitably, the discussion moves to what freedom means to you as an individual. What does liberty mean to you as an individual? The nation can be free from external influence, but at the end of the day, this independence, this sovereignty from foreign influence, in whose name is it? Who is it for? And answering these questions, somehow, perhaps at least to me, it always makes me feel as if the freedom struggle never really was finished. And even today, there are many aspects about what we did 77 years ago that continue to bog us down, that continue to require us to keep the fight going. So yes, as you can tell from the title of this book, Caged Tiger, how too much government is holding Indians back. It is a book about liberty. It is a book about freedom. And I think there's no better way. There are few better ways, at least, to commemorate our independence than by discussing this book. Mr. Bhadra, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you. And I'll leave you now to give us some opening remarks, just to introduce the book, give us a bit about the premise, the subject matter, why you chose to maybe discuss this particular subject, and how these ideas somewhat come together. I believe you have a presentation. We can take a look at that.
Excellent. Thank you, Lalit. Thanks for that introduction. I'd add something to what you said, which is, I think the journey of freedom can never be finished. I think it's something for all of us to constantly uphold. And in fact, that was one of my starting points for writing this, which is I was reading, among other things that were happening, I was reading this book about the narrow corridor, about how societies in general reach a position of economic and social prosperity. And I think they had classified it in a certain way, which I disagreed with, wherein they had said, hey, you have a weak state and a strong society. And then that's what kind of got me thinking a lot more about these issues. So while in my opening remarks, I'll talk a little bit about both the premise of the book as well as some of the reflections I've actually had since the book launch, which will help us contextualize some of the discussions that we might have. So I'll start. I have an extremely short presentation that'll probably take like some 7 or 8 minutes. I'll just put this on a slideshow. Cool. So here's a very simplistic version of what I recently thought an ideal flow of accountability should look like. Because at the end of the day, in any kind of democratic setup, or one might even argue any form of government, you're trying to kind of serve the people in the way we have set it up, the idealized version of the system that we've set up. There's a legislature responsible to the people, there's a political executive responsible to the legislature, but also indirectly to the people. And then there's a bureaucracy which kind of is responsible to the political executive. The challenge is that in the way things have evolved in India, there is a lot of blockage in this idealized flow of accountability. Primary among them, the fact that we don't have a very good system of public consultation. So in regulatory governance, where this has been studied a lot better, you have institutions like the RBI, for example, where I believe some 2% of RBI's legislation broadly defined is actually open for public consultation. For in the case of SEBI, it's like 10%. There is a policy that any law of parliament should be preceded by a public consultation, but that's met, I believe, by less than 10% of the law. So there's very little public consultation. Judicial backlog is something all of us know. Erosion of parliamentary accountability. There's a lot that people can write about this, but suffices to say that today the parliament is run by the government rather than kind of the parliament holding government accountable. And because of the way our bureaucracy is set up, I think there's a lot of operational interference, which makes the bureaucracy especially dependent on the political executive. So given that some of these middle lines of accountability start breaking down, when I say too much government, and this is a source of confusion that I think I've seen, or I don't think I've clarified enough in the book, and I've seen it be a source of confusion for folks, I'm talking about specifically the political executive wielding too much power over everything else on this chart. I haven't yet plotted the judiciary in it, but given that the political executive is not really responsible to the legislature, given that the political executive is not doing as much public consultation, and given that the bureaucracy, widely defined, is beholden to the political executive, I believe there's a lot of accretion of power that is happening in that part of this chart. Now, why does that happen? And I think that is important for us to understand, especially when you look at a fairly kind of wide book like this, which is attempting to cover a whole bunch of topics. There are common threads that I try to draw, and the reason those common threads exist is because the bulk of the way we've written the bulk of the laws we have written, especially the most important laws, for example, around police, around law and order, are based on templates that were set in the colonial times. Now, think of yourself as a colonial government. If you are a Britisher who's coming to India and writing laws for India in the 1800s, what would you want? You would want fewer constraints. You don't care about being constrained by the people of that country. So you will use vague words. So the police law, for example, uses words like keep the peace without ever defining it. And you would leave a lot of subjectivity to government. So while you would be holding yourself accountable to the parent government, which is in the UK, you don't want yourself accountable to the local government. Secondly, the way you set up the bureaucracy, because your bureaucracy is still going to be full of Indians. It's not going to be, you aren't going to move sufficient Europeans to India to actually set this up. It focuses on foreign order. So when you look at, for example, the police law, and on this slide, I will focus specifically on that. You say that obeying orders is among the first listed duties there. And because of that difference between the elite of this bureaucracy and the bulk of the bureaucracy, there's actually very limited career prospects for the lower rung. So constable, for example, has very little, almost exceptionally low ability to actually climb the ranks of the police force. The third thing you would do as a colonial power is you want to be able to control these people, but you actually don't have sufficient people to be able to control that large mass of bureaucracy. So you will bind your bureaucracy in a whole bunch of paperwork that keeps them busy, but also gives you a lot of documentation of what they are doing, what they're not doing, etc., so that you are able to keep them in control. That's what they did with the police. So in today's India, some states have the police maintaining, or a police station maintaining 250 plus documents, with a lot of them being personally maintained by these police constables. And finally, because you don't want to be controlled by that local population, you have the locus of power sitting far, far away. Because I'm sitting in Delhi as the colonial government. If I have to govern something in, let's say, rural Karnataka, I want to have full control over that sitting in Delhi. I don't want rural Karnataka to have local control, which means, therefore, that these local communities have very little say in how the governance of those systems happens. These are how you would design institutions and design laws for colonial power. Unfortunately, we took a whole bunch of those relatively unchanged and started implementing those in India. But more importantly, these values of fewer constraints, of paperwork, of following orders and discipline have permeated even newer laws that we have written since then. The second reason that we have this political executive be extremely powerful is because of the circumstances of our birth. Because at the time of independence, the context of the country was such that you had to have, for example, socialism which was believed to be a solution for the economic stagnation and starvation the country was seeing. For the caste discrimination and economic inequality, the constitution itself and the government saw itself as a reformative agent, because of which it needed to weaken some of these liberties in order to be able to play out its agenda. And finally, because of the traumas of partition and the diversity of the country and the doubts that were raised about the country even staying together, you needed a powerful center in terms of law and order. All of these perfectly reasonable decisions in 1947 are those reasonable and apt decisions today, something that is very much up for debate. And therefore, and this is something that the book goes into a lot of detail on, so I probably won't spend much time at all on this slide, but we have that in every aspect of our life, we have the government restrict it in many ways. So for example, if you talk about, as someone who's worked in the private sector a lot, the way our regulators function just introduces a lot of unpredictability and unevenness for businesses. You could have, for example, a financial sector regulator bring out a regulation and tell people that you must comply within 2 days. And that kind of thing happens way too often in terms of a regulatory setup, and which is why entrepreneurs are not really able to fulfill their jobs very well. If you look at political lives, because we don't have these direct channels of engaging with the policy of the country, therefore there's very low engagement between elections. You have weakening of governments that are closest to electors. So you have weakening of the third and second level of government, it's the state and the district level government. And finally, or to take a final example here, you have a government which interferes a lot in personal lives, perhaps with good intentions, but in that bargain also tends to interfere with people's liberties and be in places that it should not be. But here's the thing that I want to also talk about, the paradox, that while we have too much political executive, we actually have under-resourcing and understaffing of the other parts of what we might call government. The reason this happens is that if the bureaucracy's primary job is to be beholden to and serve the political executive, it actually doesn't need to be well resourced. You need to maintain that skeletal bureaucracy that is able to serve the needs of the political executive. If it was directly responsible for the people, you would probably think of designing your bureaucracy very well. Which is why, for example, if you look at the police, India has an extremely understaffed police force. It has an extremely overworked police force. It has an extremely underpaid police force, wherein 1/3 of them would leave if they had the choice to. Even if you look at this myth of the bloated bureaucracy, actually India has far fewer public servants, 1/4 as many as the US. Nearly half of them are in the railways. So if you exclude the railways, India actually has a very skeletal bureaucracy left. Of which also you do not have vacancies being filled in time. And finally, even if you look at the legislature, if an MP really wants to do his job really well, he has to read about 4,000 documents a year, which is obviously practically impossible. How other countries circumvent that issue is by giving them resources for a support staff, whereas in India, they only get about 30,000 rupees a month for support staff, in which, as you can imagine, they can barely hire anyone. So in writing this book, I actually felt a lot of sympathy for what one might call the other parts of government, apart from the political executive. Therefore, the overall picture here, because we have the strong political executive, but a very thinly staffed bureaucracy and legislature, we actually have this dichotomy where we have the successful macro, where have the world's largest election, good public safety, public health outcomes on polio eradication, etc. Great, but our everyday experiences in terms of corruption, pollution, the judicial backlog, undernutrition leads a lot to be desired, and therefore actually mix this notion of liberty with the notion of the question of how do you build better state capacity. And this is the last slide with which I end, which is this notion of state capacity and freedoms, or the intersection of both, has been studied very well in the context of regulators, where a paper, for example, 2018 called out what are the elements of a high-performing regulator. And I try to simplify that and say, how do you think about free markets or free society version of building state of capacity across different kinds of institutions beyond regulators? I come up with 3 principles, and the book is essentially about how to start applying these principles to sector after sector. So how the book is essentially chapterized is that there's this introduction, which gives a lot of this context. Then there are about 7 or 8 chapters which go sector by sector and talk about how do you start applying these principles of good institutions. And then there's a wrap up on how do you start thinking about the future and the evolution of these institutions. So I perhaps went a bit over time, but I hope some of this was useful. Let you make a mute.
Yeah, no, not at all. I think this gives a great overview of what I found while reading the book as well, and it picks out a few points that really, that are worth bringing out to an audience which might not have read the book yet. But one of the things that I wanted to in reading the book, one of the things that I really wanted to ask was, you've covered a vast range of topics. Quite a number of topics have come together in this book. Anybody who reads the book will find that each chapter covers a different kind of freedom, and within that chapter, many different aspects of that freedom are somehow discussed at length. So, for instance, you've discussed economic freedoms, and you've discussed free speech and surveillance. We've looked at personal liberty in light of both police and jail reforms. You've looked at cultural freedoms, and you've also covered how legislatures work, how regulators work. So this entire swathe of issues, this entire spectrum of issues, if you may, what I wanted to ask was, would you say that all of them come together well in the sense of, what do you find in common about it? Why is it that we haven't done well on some of the freedoms, for instance? Why are we doing poorly on all of them? Is there any other freedom out there in India which is doing well that maybe you didn't need to cover in the book? Or is there something, in common at play, something simultaneously at play in all of these different aspects? You've somewhat covered it, the colonial roots and institutional issues, but why isn't there an exception? Why hasn't there been an exception to this?
So, I think it was a very deliberate choice to start looking at this in a combined way, because the study of public institutions, at least to the best of my knowledge till before I kind of started writing this, had been limited to specific institutions. So you would find a lot of essays on saying, how do you think about environmental regulation? How do you think about speech regulation? There obviously been a ton of book about speech regulation itself. I did think that the kind of missing block here was to start looking at them together. There's obviously, I believe, some benefit, which is why I wrote the book, but there's also certain limitation, which is you miss the nuance, you miss the specificities. There are something unique to, for example, how speech is practiced in India, which is not true for how economics is practiced. But that said, the purpose of writing this book is to start provoking that conversation, even if people kind of come and say, hey, look, I don't think this particular aspect is common between these two kinds of institutions or freedoms. So that was a very deliberate choice. Now, the reason I made that deliberate choice was for 3 reasons. One is that when you look at the history of institutions or public institutions, it is generally seen that transplantation does not work, which is that, sitting here, I might, and this is a conversation that I was certainly very involved in, I'm sure so for you, that, there's so much energy and time that was spent on designing the best data protection authority. And of course, not that we've come anywhere close to it in the law that was passed, but I think a lot of people felt that, hey, look, we are going to design this with the best principles, etc. But unless your superstructure is this, or the foundations are the ones that we currently have in India, you can't transplant a great regulator and put it in India. Over time, the greatness of that regulator will be eroded, it will reduce to the common denominator. So as we think about designing good regulatory institutions, we have to think about really fixing the common threads in all of them. The second is, I believe that these freedoms are intrinsically interlinked. Um, for example, when you talk about economic freedoms and political freedoms, and this is something that Ajay Shah said to me, which made a lot of sense, that given how closely our government controls the economy, for any entrepreneur to actually make a political statement comes at great commercial risk. Which means if you're wealthiest of people who in other jurisdictions would typically be the ones who are funding think tanks and other kind of things, if these people are no longer willing to fund think tanks, you have civil society starting to become smaller because funding for research and activism and advocacy is not available domestically. And that's, for example, one way in which these things are interlinked. Your political freedoms will also be interlinked, or surveillance, for example, will be interlinked to economic freedom. So there's quantitative studies which show that in parts of Germany, which were under communist rule and there was higher spy density, you actually have worse economic outcomes. So you can't even think of freedoms in isolation because these freedoms are actually linked to each other. But most importantly, the way you think of liberties in the context of formal institutions is fundamentally affected by how you think of informal institutions or culture. Over time, I think informal institutions, which I do not cover as much in this book, but things like culture, things like norms, values of the society, those become far more important, and those are going to again start affecting everything. So I, as an individualist, I believe, hey, look, I trust the government. We must cede more of our rights to the government, let it do what it wants, etc. Or if I'm in favor, therefore, of a more prescriptive government, then I will be fine with them being prescriptive both in the economic sphere as well as in the speech sphere. So this is why I thought it was important to start linking all of these together. It is admittedly not perfect, but hopefully starts a conversation around some of these issues.
Thank you so much. Before I go ahead, I just thought I'll interject and mention that any attendees who have any questions to ask, please, there will be a question and answer round for the audience at the end of the talk, the discussion. So please just put in your questions in the question box, which you will see below on the screen. But yes, Subhashish, what you mentioned about cultural norms and about the choice that you made in picking this particular subject matter, these are things that I want to get back one by one to, particularly at the end when we are discussing institutions and how they are an antidote. But I wanted to somewhat take this, take the discussion to maybe the other end of the spectrum, maybe. In your choice, in the book, you've made the choice to emphasize liberties and freedoms. And historically, in a way, India, ever since independence and since it got its constitution, in the constitution itself, in many of the ways in which governance is designed in India, there's been a strong emphasis on equality. So I just wanted to, because this is not something that's discussed very deeply in the book, I just wanted to get your views on how you see equality fitting within the framework that you're discussing, and in terms of the choice you made in discussing this particular subject. For example, I think very much that it was a good choice in the sense that that's where we've been lacking. And I think that the spread of topics, as you mentioned, while they did go through a lot of issues, they really provoke that thought about why are things like this. It can't be a coincidence that there are so many liberties that are at stake, that are in jeopardy right now. But I wanted to get a little bit of an understanding about how you see this, the topic that you chose, how you see it fitting within something larger in terms of what are sometimes called contrary values, like equality.
Thanks for the question, Lalit. I think it's a interesting one because I, as an author in this case, I very deliberately tried to keep my own perspectives around rights as far as I could, because I wanted to try to reduce this to the lowest common denominator. The reason I did that, as you rightly said, I think there's been a lot of thinking, there's been a lot of writing on equality and how we as a country should both interpret it and have the right to experience. However, I don't think too many people, I think the case for liberty has historically been much weaker in our country, especially in popular discourse. And therefore, that's the battle I strategically chose to fight rather than. So rather than the one about equality. So it was a very deliberate choice in terms of where I saw the bigger gap in terms of how we are writing and thinking about it. But here's the other thing that I have come to believe in the process of writing this book, which is essentially you're taking a society which is fundamentally not equal. These inequalities are economic, these inequalities are based on caste, religion, and so many other aspects of inequality. The state is obviously trying to correct a whole bunch of those inequalities through its commitment in the constitution. But does our state actually have the capacity to be able to judge that extent of correction very well, or do we run the risk of the state actually, because of the poor institutional design, getting captured by some of those interests, and therefore either undercorrecting or perpetually undercorrecting or overcorrecting or whatever else? Right? So I think the notion of correcting inequality requires a lot of nuance, requires a fair amount of state capacity, which we currently lack. Does that mean, therefore, that we give up the pursuit of equality till we have better state capacity? That's obviously not the line of argument I make. The line of argument I make is that we reduce the pursuit of equality to what is very explicitly spoken about in the Constitution, therefore forms our constitutional norms. So to the extent, therefore, that equality is part of our constitutional norms, I think I certainly speak about that and saying that this is a worthwhile thing. But the reason I don't focus on it is because I personally, and certainly in the process of writing this book, do get scared of a government which is trying to do too much without necessarily having the capacity and the nuance to be able to effectively execute it, and neither the restraint to be able to prevent yourself from either overcorrecting or undercorrecting. So the way I think of this is that the government takes fewer things to do, saying that, hey, look, we are going to fix such and such aspect of equality, and goes behind that and builds state capacity by doing before it takes on more expansive mandate. And that's where my espousal of liberty is linked to my espousal of a smaller state, but that smaller state in pursuit of a more effective state. So that's how I think about it.
No, that does make a compelling argument. It's this sort of a trade-off, though we hear about it so often, that it's easy to forget the realities in which India is operating. We've had a number of decades in which the project of equality has been functioning with a low capacity state. And it's definitely thought-provoking that we have to consider whether even the project of equality can be supplemented, can be made better, can be improved if we think about a few alternative ways in which it can be done. But I guess this exact interplay, it comes out much more starkly when we perhaps discuss economic restraints and economic freedoms. That's where most people struggle to come to an easy reconciliation between economic freedoms and equality. It's probably a very classic question in political science and in economic policy. But I wanted to hear from you, because the book makes a good case that we do have to expand economic freedoms. And I do understand very much that those freedoms have an interplay with the other freedoms as well. Like you mentioned with speech and political freedoms, they do rely on how much economic freedom you've provided. But how would you say your argument about economic freedoms, how do you say that sits with the current paradigm in Indian economic policy? There is a paradigm, and there is a way in which many scholars in economics think about this subject. How do you think that fits there? And do you think that, and you already mentioned how economic freedoms can be looked at differently from the other freedoms. So maybe I wanted to hear a little more about that. How do you see those distinctions coming out?
Thanks for a great question, Lazet. If I have to characterize our existing economic paradigm in the country, I would perhaps characterize it a begrudging toleration of the private sector. What I mean by that is, and this is a metaphor I use in the book as well, that when we in 1991 and over the 1990s liberalized, we handed over the steering wheel of the car to the private sector, whereas the brake, the clutches, everything else was still in government control. And I don't know how many of you or the audience have experienced this, but this is basically how I learned driving. So while I felt I was driving, I wasn't actually driving, I was just moving the steering wheel. What that means is, I think there's a great recognition that the most successful model of long-term wealth creation for a population or long-term economic prosperity is capitalism broadly defined. So I think that is the path that we have chosen as a country. But at the same time, because there is a historical mistrust of the private sector, and because ironically, because I think state capacity to regulate is so weak that we think of the government still holding the reins of the private sector in its hands, and which is why we have this expansive regulatory state. We have so many regulators that have come up with questionable design around their functioning. So we have a private sector that we believe in, but there is a government which restrains it. The reason that the government tolerates it is because it leads to economic prosperity. But the third factor is that it enables the government to fund a welfareist state, because I think that is a common theme that all of our governments have pursued. So that is how I would characterize the current economic paradigm of the country, which is this begrudging toleration of the private sector. Do I think of economic freedoms as fundamentally different? I don't think of them necessarily as fundamentally different. I, in fact, think of them as joined at the hip, which is because of the interlinkages I spoke about. And in the 1940s, when the World War had just ended and a whole bunch of European countries and countries across the globe were going in the direction of socialism, Hayek and others kind of came in and said that, look, this is, as he wrote in his book, this is the road to serfdom. Because when you have a government that is so expansive in the economy, it starts affecting your other rights as well. And in the book, I also explore causality in the other direction. So I think they joined at the hip, but to the extent, however, that economic freedoms, I believe it's somewhat, there's less subjectivity, and because because you can actually measure it in GDP per capita, right? Which, for example, and everyone agrees that greater GDP per capita is great for the country. Whereas when you think of free speech, I don't think that is necessarily something all of us would agree to. I don't think everyone's going to say, hey, look, more free speech is better, right? Because we'll say, hey, what about hate speech? And what about other forms of undesirable speech? So because of this whole notion of being able to measure it very objectively, I think economic freedoms, to some extent, it's easy to build consensus around it in a way that it's not easy to build it around the other political freedoms that we have. So that, I think, is one fundamental difference, which therefore leads to differences in the way people interpret and talk about these issues. But I still do think that they're joined at the hip.
Yeah, very much so. Would you say that maybe, in a sense, in India, economic freedoms have been given less of a weightage as compared to the civil and political freedoms? Maybe that's, even though, as you suggest, it is true that it's easier to perhaps get people to agree on it now that they have a better understanding of it. But historically, maybe there's been less of an emphasis on it. We pretty much lost the property, the freedom of
historically, definitely so, Lalit, but that is also because if you think of the popular consensus in the economics of that time, India has always had the pattern of sticking close to that, right? So to the extent we might criticize the government for following a socialist or its version of the socialist policy in the 1960s and 70s, but that is where the majority of the world was. And I don't think it's the evolution in India as much as it's the evolution in the global consensus on economics that has moved a lot more free markets, the Washington consensus and everything else that happened in the 1990s. So India's just moved with the global consensus. So I don't necessarily penalize us for having been socialist 40 years back. I just think we've followed what the global consensus was. However, I do think that the unsaid or the thing people don't realize about the reforms was the extent to which the government really retained all of its controls over the economy.
Right. Okay, I think we can take another different aspect. You have been for a long time involved in technology policy, so you've seen the nitty-gritties of how it's working. And as somebody that has also been researching it on and off over the years, one of the themes that I constantly see in this subject matter, in this area, is this sense of dread about the future. And at the same time, when it comes to India, this sense of frustration that many of the freedoms when it comes to free speech, not just free speech in the ordinary sense, but also free speech in the context of technology, and freedom from surveillance and informational privacy. These kinds of freedoms are things on which we are lagging quite a bit, by which I mean that we have a lot of legacy issues, we have baggage. We haven't even gotten past, a minimal stage of developing these freedoms well. And we see this onslaught of the future coming forward. So I just wanted to get a sense of how you see this playing out. How do you think, what would be a good way for viewers to be able to assess where India is at on these kinds of freedoms, and given the problems that might be coming in the future, technology allowing people to speak more freely, so there will be more voices, and the ability to understand what's happening with free speech would be reduced, and the sheer quantity of data and data transfers are just going to keep multiplying. How do we see ourselves coming into this zone?
So here's how I would think about it, that if you look at history of a post-independence nation, one would obviously argue that, look, we've not really had as much free speech as we should have. The government and sometimes might not have chosen to use their tools of restricting free speech as much as in other periods, but those tools always existed, and those tools were used at times when it was politically convenient for the government. So again, for example, the first banning of a book was a book on the Mahabharata. There was obviously banning of a whole bunch of other books, the censorship of cinema, etc., both from a political perspective as well as from a moral perspective. So historically, if one looked at speech, again, I'm not the expert on this, but clearly there was much that was lacking. However, I think that the advent of the technology space now puts the entire world, not just India, in uncharted territory. What I mean by that is now, in addition to thinking about free speech online, you also think about platform regulation or content moderation on online platforms. And therefore, even those countries which thought that they had perhaps reached their steady state of free speech regulation are now having to revisit that in the context of just the volumes and the difficulty of regulating that the technology space opens up. So I think to that extent, there is an opportunity for India to actually, just like every other country, start reevaluating that balance and get to a better space. However, the reason I've become a little bit more pessimistic about this right in particular, especially in this context of technology, is two things. Firstly, that very often it is even difficult to know how your speech rights are being played around with. So what I mean by that is that if, for example, there's a certain algorithm that Facebook follows in terms of what it amplifies and what it doesn't or what it suppresses, to the extent that I, as a user, don't even know what those algorithms are. I do not know whether my post is being pumped up, or it's being bumped down. It's very difficult for me to even know whether my rights of free speech are being violated. It's difficult to even argue what is violation of free speech in these kind of algorithmic-driven social media platforms. So that, I think, makes it very difficult for us to have a conversation around free speech in the online sphere. The second is speech has always been one of those things, because of India's cultural values, that we find a lot of difficulty building consensus on. Because a whole bunch of things come in, right? We are a culture which is, and I'm sure all of us have experienced that in our personal life, somewhat shy of criticizing authority. It is inherently nationalistic that, for example, any criticism of armed forces would be something that is looked down upon. So because of those kind of dynamics that are part of our cultural DNA, it's very difficult for us to start building a consensus and say that, hey, this is what free speech or this is what speech regulation in India would look like. Unlike, for example, economic regulation, or I would say even regulation of movies or something like that. So that makes me inherently somewhat pessimistic about it. But at the same time, we are in uncharted territory. What gives me a little bit more hope is that if more and more people start talking about, again, start linking some of these freedoms together, that perhaps we might be able to build a political consensus around it, which is why the fundamental argument that I keep going back to is that quantitative data shows that countries in which people are more educated and therefore ask more questions do well economically and socially, irrespective of whether it's a democracy or a dictatorship. And I think that causality is important. So when you talk about, or when you criticize, or when you exercise your right to free speech, it's not because you are pursuing liberty, or not just because you're pursuing liberty, but also because you think of this as a great service that you're doing to the nation by helping it actually prosper economically as well.
No, that's exactly how that's yeah, I read the case in the book, and it does make complete sense to me. Um, Frankly, though, there is a I do think we're in trouble. I get that the case that you're making for building out of this situation, but I feel like there's the window to be able to meet the future challenges is getting narrower until with the past baggage not having been solved yet. Um,
I think that's a very interesting question because one of the questions that have been asked is, have we seen good examples of institutions strengthening over time, or is always a one-way downward slope? And it is true that we struggle with that, right? Apart from the RTI, which also one might argue has mixed results, have there been great examples of massive institutional changes? I don't think so. But at the same time, I do not think we have the option but to start building greater political consensus or alliances around this, which is starting to make the political case. Because in a country like ours, unless an issue becomes political, I think there's very little chance of it going through. And the RTI movement does show us that the way they actually got it done was by doing a lot of grassroots mobilization in Rajasthan and other states. So I share your pessimism, but one of the things I often say is, what alternative do you have but to be optimistic?
we have to try.
Yes.
We don't try, we just regret it. Yeah, so I guess we're coming towards 5:45 to the attendees again. If you have any questions, please do feel free to put it down in the question box. I will put it forward and I'll read it out for the audience as well. I had one last question though before we move into the audience questions, which is that the other main character in your book, other than liberty or freedom, the other main character is institutions. And both in your presentation and as well as in your answers so far, you have been bringing this out quite a bit about how institutions play such an important role. And to readers of the book, they might find it a little odd that we're reading about these individual freedoms for quite a bit. We're reading about economic freedoms, about free speech, about cultural freedoms. And then towards the end of the book, we start having chapters which are about institutions, about the police, about the legislature, about regulators. And this is a theme that perhaps if those who have not looked through this kind of literature, this is a theme that a certain set of scholars in India have really been emphasizing and stressing since quite a few years. The idea of institutionalism and institutional economics. So I wanted you, Subhashish, to give us a little bit of an overview about, I mean, perhaps you can touch on how the origins of this academic area are and where it stands right now, but a little bit also about the why. Why has this been emphasized so much in the context of freedom? The idea of good institutional design.
Got it. So here's, and I also think there's a fundamental lack of clarity in the space in general is institutions versus organizations. The definition I take of institutions here is the wider definition of institutions, which is and especially when I talk about formal institutions, any kind of written down code is what I consider formal institutions. Whereas a lot of the literature here in this area has typically spoken about a particular public institution, which is actually an organization. So they think about, for example, election commission as an organization, whereas I think of it as in political lives as in kind of set of institutions, a set of laws which come together to create your political life, of which the election commission is just one part. Now, as far as we think about, as we think about the background of the academic literature on this topic, my introduction to it obviously happened through the lens of regulatory institutions, because as an economist, post 1991, we've had a proliferation of regulators. And I remember reading some global statistic, which was like every country on average creates 2 new regulators every year or something of that sort, right? So we're moving from a centrally planned economy to a regulator-driven economy, and therefore that was my entry point to this. And there's been a lot of academic literature on specific regulators, like the environment regulator, the food regulator, etc. You'd find a lot of great work on that, including these 2 compendiums that Pratap and Devesh and others have put together. At the same time, however, I think people have also written historically a lot about institutions as in organizations which are non-regulatory. So the Election Commission, for example, or even the judiciary, where there's been a lot written on the police as well. I think each of those has its own histories. So, for example, the literature on policing as an institution is far older than, for example, on elections or other things. So that's the body of work that I draw from. But again, the change that I make, or the different lens at which I look at it, is of thinking of institutions as wider than just organization. Because I think once you start doing that, you start forming more holistic views of how all of these affects people. And therefore, as you think about all the chapters that I've created in my book, it's not so much about a particular organization, but it's about how these affect particular aspects of a citizen's lives. So I think, we will possibly in this literature keep building on either the institutional leg or the organizational leg, but I think it's important for readers to also be able to differentiate between the two.
Right. Are there any, again, is there any question that the audience would like to ask? Please don't hesitate to put it down in the question box. I will make sure to put it forward. I guess one more point that I can ask from my end, and my going on shouldn't be taken as any discouragement for anybody to ask a question, but there were a lot of things that came to mind. And one of the other things that I was really thinking about when reading the book was how we can try and contextualize what you're talking about in today's political scenario, in today's world, and in the context of how we think about choices that we make in politics are, for example, in certain chapters, I guess in the cultural freedoms chapter, or maybe in free speech as well, you've pointed out that various political outfits in India have been involved, have been pretty much guilty of eroding freedoms, either in their own ways or in the same way. They've all been somewhat responsible. And I think that speaks a lot to your argument that there is something fundamentally, problematic about how India has been dealing with the question of freedom. But would you feel like that's a fair way of allocating responsibility? Are there situations in which maybe the threats to freedom have gotten worse? Or could it be that in a somewhat zoomed out sense, if we look at the bigger picture, we've actually made a lot of progress in developing freedoms in the last 77 years? How did you see this playing out, both in terms of the players and in terms of history, post-independence history?
So to start with, here's what I would say. I was recently in a talk that Bill Clinton was giving, and one of the points he made very emphatically was that as bad as things look right now, things have always felt bad. And look, at the end of the day, as a country, we've obviously, even in post-independence time, been through what one might argue are worse times than any history, and we've kind of rebounded from them, right? So while I therefore don't want that to become an excuse for myself to really take a back seat or not feel strongly about things, I at least use that to temper my emotions. That said, I think the question I ask is that as long as these tools of suppression exist, it's only a matter of choice and personal preference of the powers that be on whether they use it. And to the extent that these tools have fundamentally existed since almost independence time, I think we've always had those threats to democracy, threats to freedoms, even though the threat might not have been enforced. Now, if you talk about recent times, obviously a lot of people argue that, hey, look, because the soft guardrails of democracy are coming off, because we're now willing to do things that we historically were not willing to do, wherein we are, for example, the executive is confronting the judiciary and vice versa, and to this extent, it's probably never happened outside of the emergency. People do believe that things are getting worse. But the thing about institutions is, because when you take that wider definition of institutions, at that point, you're talking about so many different aspects that you're making progress somewhere, but you're receding somewhere else. Which is, for example, if you look at gay rights, right? We are obviously now we have made a lot of progress, and hopefully we'll continue to make that kind of progress. If you think about even political rights or kind of rights of minorities, I think because of the spread of internet and therefore the spread of media in that context, but more importantly, because of our dependence on foreign capital for a whole bunch of things and foreign capital's preference for political stability, that I think that places some soft guardrails around the government. So now today, if I was a government which was trying to be mostly autocratic, I don't think I can create social upheaval in the country because that's bad economically and therefore will hurt even my voter who I actually care about. So I think some of those institutional changes have been in the positive direction. Again, I will reiterate the fact that at the end of the day, your formal institutions, your public institutions, organizations are going to start descending to what your informal institutions or your societal values, etc. are. So I think all of this will remain somewhat theoretical or remain prone to degradation unless we start building the popular consensus for some of these values that we espouse. So even though, for example, I do not talk as much about a values-oriented approach to institutions in the book, but I think if we want to go down that path, we have to build a political consensus for
that. You also happen to mention in the course of the talk today itself the role of social norms. How society's values that we hold as individuals about what we say the respect to authority or those forms of ways of looking at liberty. Is that something that you came upon post writing the book as something that you felt you could have incorporated in some way, or you have it in some sense, but it's not been the main character of the book?
Yeah, it's definitely not the main character of the book. One might even argue it's an afterthought. But I would say that, yes, it was something that I realized almost as I was wrapping up the book, that I think as you start putting this entire narrative together, it boils down to those informal institutions. And I dug a little bit into the links between formal and informal institutions and what does literature or research have to say about that. And I think it's fairly unambiguous about the strong links, especially about informal institutions and culture affecting formal institutions. I think that is something that deserves further inquiry. I don't think this book was the one that did that, but I think to the extent that this book is a call for action for fixing the foundation of all public institutions in India, the most important element of that foundation becomes our value. And to the extent, for example, that, and I'm sure we are passing through a phase of experience that in our everyday lives, that there's a certain tolerance for a very prescriptive government. I don't think till we, for example, start chipping away at that and making the case for liberty more broadly, that we actually get to a position where our public institutions start valuing liberty.
All right. Any questions? You would have to speak now or hold your tongue. Maybe you never know whether you get a chance to ask again. Subhashish's next talk maybe you may not hear about it. Anyway, I guess then we can end things here. To the audience, Subhashish's book, Cage Tiger, is a compelling argument. As we've been discussing, even if you do not agree on specific issues or specific approaches about specific aspects of Indian society and governance, you cannot ignore how, when we look at all of these different aspects, there is something common at play, and there is something that we should be concerned about. And the solutions that he offers are extremely potent solutions. He has updated and upgraded certain issues, certain prescriptions that economists have been putting forward since quite a few decades in other countries, and in India since at least a decade or so. These are points that you might find not that accessible in certain forms of literature if you try and look out for it. But this is the kind of book where you will be able to see a view about what Indian government can be like if we really mean to be free. With that, Subhashish, thank you so much. And I hope that your next book will take forward the story from here, and we'll be discussing this again in some years to come. The call to action is something that I will certainly be taking personally as something we will be that we have to act upon. In a way, the old slogans and the old stories about the freedom struggle, they somewhat lose their they lose their brightness over the years. They don't compel us to act as much. But that only means that we need to look for new stories and new slogans. And I think this book will be able to offer readers some of that. So thank you so much. Thanks to everyone who's joined. Please look forward to our next book, Adda. We don't know what book it's going to be, but do keep a lookout for it. Thanks so much, and good night, I guess. Good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.